Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are pulling on a thread that leads to, well, a pretty profound intellectual controversy. We're looking at a figure whose work you'd think would be foundational, but for decades it was anything but. We're talking about Maulana Wahiduddin Khan. His life is this stunning journey from inside the political Islamic movement to becoming its most meticulous, early, and systematic critic.
It is, and the sources you shared capture this perfectly. They use this ancient, really evocative term to describe him, Kans Makbu,
Kans Makbu.
which translates, literally as hidden treasure.
And that phrase, that's really the intellectual hook for this whole deep dive, isn't it? Because hidden treasures suggest two contradictory things at once.
Exactly.
First, it's acknowledging this immense value in his thought, the intellectual gold he produced. But second, it strongly implies that this treasure wasn't just overlooked, it was deliberately concealed, maybe even buried.
Yes, actively buried. Khan's project was this massive critical undertaking. He was aiming to dismantle the core ideological pillars that shaped so much of the modern landscape.
So our mission today is to figure out how he developed these revolutionary ideas, what was actually in this treasure chest, and maybe most crucially, why a thinker of this caliber was just so marginalized. Why was he so unknown in the wider Arab world for so long?
It's the paradox of the marginalized genius, isn't it? A voice of incredible depth that just stood completely outside the mainstream spotlight.
It is. So let's start at the beginning. Let's unpack his foundations. Who was Maulana Wahiduddin Khan?
Well, he was born in India in 1925. And to really get his thought, you have to understand that context. India is, it's a land defined by its massive religious and cultural diversity.
Right.
And that environment, it just inherently forces a certain perspective on faith. You have to acknowledge plurality, coexistence, and a really robust external intellectual challenge.
And the sources really emphasize his education. It was instrumental. He didn't just get traditional religious instruction at Madrasa al-Islah. He also pursued this extensive, almost obsessive exposure to Western thought.
And that combination gave him this intellectual dual literacy. He was fluent in the ancient and the modern.
It seems like it was more than just literacy, though. It was a whole methodology.
Oh, absolutely. It was a commitment to intellectual rigor that defined his entire approach. The sources mention this extraordinary fact. When he decided to write his critique of Marxism, he didn't just read summaries or other people's critiques.
Okay.
He read approximately 10,000 pages of original source material in English, straight from the authors he wanted to critique.
10,000 pages. That's not research. That's an intellectual deployment.
It really is. And it's the core difference between responding to an idea and responding to the source of an idea. Khan refused to engage with the caricature.
Right. No straw man.
Exactly. He insisted on understanding the idea from its absolute origin in all its complexity, using his mastery of English. Only then could he start his dismantling, making sure he was always standing on solid intellectual ground.
And that rigor, that led pretty quickly to his first hugely influential book, Islam Challenges. This is where we see him introducing his solution to the modern crisis of faith.
Yes, this is what the sources call his Ilm Kalam Jadid, his new science of theology.
So to appreciate the new, we have to understand the old. What was the original Ilm Kalam trying to do?
The original science of theology was, developed centuries ago.
Yeah.
It was built to address the intellectual challenges of its time, mainly Greek and Hellenistic philosophy.
And it worked for that.
It served its purpose admirably then, but Khan saw that those tools were completely inadequate against the modern, aggressive challenges of the 20th century. I'm talking about materialism, Darwinism.
So it's like showing up to a modern fight with the wrong gear.
Precisely. He saw it as fighting a tank with a sword. The tools were just outdated for the philosophical battlefield they were on.
So this is where his dual literacy and his methodological rigor really come into play.
Absolutely. He turns the enemy's weapon science against them. The dominant trend was to use scientific findings to promote atheism, to negate the idea of a creator.
And he argued the complete opposite.
The complete opposite. Khan demonstrated that modern science, with all its equations, its complexity, its discoveries, it isn't a weapon of doubt. He argued it's the single greatest source of rational proof for an intelligent designer.
So he's not talking about abstract philosophy, he's talking about physics. about biology.
Exactly. He would point to the incredible, just minute precision of the cosmic constants. You know, how a tiny infinitesimal change in the gravitational constant, for example, would mean the universe couldn't even exist.
Wow.
And he'd move from there to the staggering, irreducibly complex machinery inside a single living cell. His point was that these instances of fine-tuning make the idea of pure, undirected chance. Well, it makes it impossible, both rationally and scientifically.
So he's speaking directly to the modern, educated mind, in a language it gets, a language it respects. He's not just imposing faith, he's leading you on this intellectual journey where faith is the most rational conclusion.
And that was vital for a generation that was encountering these aggressive modern challenges for the very first time.
Okay, so moving from the external defense of faith, let's look at his internal project, how he reread the Quran itself. His commentary is called Tazkir al-Qawim fi Tafsir al-Quran al-Hakim. And that name, Tazkir, reminder or admonition, that's key, isn't it?
It defines his entire view of the Quran's primary function. For Khan, the Quran is fundamentally a book of guidance and tazkir. Its core role is to address the human heart and mind, to connect man with God.
Which means it is not what?
It is not primarily a scientific textbook, a history book, or, and this is the most contentious part, a political blueprint.
That sounds simple, but it led him to a really radical proposal aimed at solving this, modern problem of information overload.
It did. A very bold proposal. He said we should structurally separate writing about the Quran into two distinct types. First, you have tafsir interpretation, and that must focus only on faith, spiritual reform, and admonition. The goal is a present heart, a living connection with God.
And the second category takes care of everything else.
Everything else. A comprehensive encyclopedia split into chapters for specialists, language, jurisprudence, history, law, you name it. That's for the scholars.
I can really see the logic there, especially for a modern reader. We are just saturated with information. So this structure, it basically acts as a spiritual filter, right? It protects the average person who's seeking guidance from getting lost in these highly technical arguments that might actually be a barrier.
That is exactly his point. He saw that confusing the two was turning the Quran from this living, accessible guide for the soul into a complex, specialized textbook for the mind. And that shift was a huge loss of clarity and power.
And this emphasis on the individual, on inner reform, this is what leads him into the defining conflict of his entire career.
This is the deep ideological split that really solidified his place as a hidden treasure. Khan was once part of the Jamaat-e-Islami in India, but he resigned after a profound intellectual dispute with its founder, Abul Ala-Maududi.
A huge figure regarded by many as the spiritual father of political Islamic movements globally. What was the core of that conflict?
Khan argued that Maududi had made a fatal intellectual error, one he called the political interpretation of religion.
And he used a powerful analogy with Marx for that.
He did. Khan claimed Maududi basically did to religion what Karl Marx did to history. He reduced all its dimensions, theology, ethics, spirituality, to a single, all-consuming political goal. For Marx, it was economics. For Maududi's school, it was politics and establishing a state.
That's a huge charge. So to dismantle that, he had to challenge the root assumption that the mission of all prophets was political revolution. How did he do that?
He used these simple textual examples that are very hard to refute. Did Abraham establish a government? No. Did Jesus? No. The vast majority of prophets had no political power. Their mission was tazkir, reminding and guiding people to God.
But the obvious counterargument from the political school is the Prophet Muhammad. He did establish the state of Medina.
And that's the crucial distinction. Khan argued that the state in Medina was a pragmatic consequence of the success of dawah, the call to faith. It wasn't the goal of prophethood itself. He was a prophet first, and then, circumstantially, he became a ruler. The model of Medina is one of just governance, not the primary mission of the faith.
The example of Moses he uses is incredibly powerful, too.
It completely undercuts the premise. After Pharaoh drowns, the political stage in Egypt is wide open, a perfect power vacuum. Does Moses go back to establish an Islamic government?
No. He takes the children of Israel and leaves.
He leaves the political stage entirely. If establishing a state was the essential mission, Moses would have failed spectacularly at his moment of ultimate victory.
So if the prophet's mission wasn't political, then the acts of worship must have been corrupted by this interpretation as well.
Catastrophically so, in Khan's view. Under the political interpretation, things like prayer, fasting, Hajj, they get reduced from spiritual ends into political means. Prayer becomes a form of organizational discipline. Hajj becomes a global political conference.
And Khan insisted they are intrinsic spiritual ends.
Exactly. They purify the soul, they connect you directly with God. Reducing them to political drills just empties the faith of its entire ethical and moral substance.
And that leads us to the concept that has caused so much global damage: jihad. How did he approach that?
He was absolutely clear in his rejection of revolutionary jihad, any action aimed at overthrowing rulers. He insisted that legitimate combat jihad is purely defensive and, critically, is the sole responsibility of the state, never individuals or groups.
What about the famous hadith? The best jihad is a word of truth before a tyrannical ruler. That gets used all the time to justify opposition.
Khan's clarification is so important. The hadith specifically says saying the word. It's about counsel, advice, intellectual critique, an act of moral courage, not an invitation to armed revolt. He said confusing the individual's role with the state's responsibility is what leads directly to chaos and violence.
That kind of internal conflict must cause serious psychological strain on anyone inside that ideology. And Khan had this brilliant metaphor for it: the inverted vessel.
It's one of his most insightful contributions, really, to the psychology of extremism. He said the mind, saturated by this political interpretation, becomes like an inverted vessel. You can pour the purest water on it, spirituality, devotion, fear of God, but it all just slides right off the surface.
Why, though? What's the mechanism that stops the water from being absorbed?
It's because the mind has been programmed to see all spiritual content as just preliminary. It's a warm-up for the main event, which is the political goal of building a state. So if that political goal is frustrated or it fails, the spiritual content loses its anchor. The entire faith system is only valued as a means to power. When power fails, the vessel is empty.
So if political upheaval isn't the answer, what was Khan's alternative? How do you turn the vessel right side up again?
Through individual reform. Islam min al-dakhil, reform from within. He had this core principle that resonates so powerfully today. The people whose members hold themselves accountable first, their affairs prosper. The people whose members are busy holding others accountable, their affairs decline.
That immediately shifts the focus. It moves from blaming the outside world rulers, the West, whoever, to fixing your own inner world.
Exactly. And this focus on self-accountability and ethics was his bulwark against extremism. He said fighting terrorism needs more than just security solutions. It requires an intellectual literary bomb, a complete re-engineering of the extremist mindset at its source.
And he was completely uncompromising on the consequences for individuals who chose violence.
He was. He explicitly stated that suicide bombers face an ignorant death and that no paradise awaits them. That clarity is just so characteristic of his rigor. He even called for establishing a global center for peace to promote a culture of dialogue.
I also love how he redefined the Prophet's tradition, the Sunnah. He was critical of how it gets reduced to just superficial things like specific clothing or using a miswak.
Yes, things that are easy to display. He argued the true Sunan, the traditions, are the great ethical virtues. Suppressing anger, beautiful forbearance, immense patience, perfecting your work. Those are the deeper traditions that build genuine character.
So to bring this all together for our listeners, what are the two monumental contributions that Maulana Wahiduddin Khan leaves us with?
First, he reestablished the absolute primacy of dawah, the peaceful mission. He restored Islam to its central function as a message of peace and reminder, or tazkir. He clarified that the Muslim's primary role is to be a muthakkir, a reminder based on that Quranic verse. So remind, for you are only a reminder. You are not a controller over them.
And second,
he provided the earliest, most systematic, and most rigorous internal critique of political Islam. He published a seminal work on this error in interpretation way back in 1963.
1963, that's decades before those ideas metastasized into the violent realities we saw later.
Decades. He was warning of the ideological fault line long before the ground ever started to shake.
Which brings us full circle, back to the hidden treasure. Why was a thinker this profound, this prolific, and so early? Why was he marginalized and essentially silenced for decades?
The source material is very direct about this. The political Islamic currents that dominated religious publishing for decades saw Khan's ideas as an existential threat to their entire project.
So his books, especially Error in Interpretation, they weren't just overlooked by accident, they were actively suppressed.
There was an imposed near-total blackout on his voice within major publishing houses. It was a mechanism of intellectual filtering, making sure only ideas that aligned with the dominant political narrative ever reached the public. This critical voice was effectively buried.
It's a chilling thought, and maybe the one we should leave you with today. We've seen how the physical control of books and publishers in the 60s and 70s could marginalize a vital voice like Wahiduddin Khan.
But today, if a thinker as deep and as early as Khan could be deliberately suppressed back then, we have to ask ourselves, what kind of new digital filters, what algorithmic biases and controlled echo chambers are acting as the new political publishers?
What crucial critical voices are being turned into digital hidden treasures right now and prevented from ever reaching us?
Something to mull over as you continue your own journey.
Thanks for diving deep with us. We'll see you next time.